Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be with all of you today to celebrate the publication of this book, Learning Education Policy in Practice. My name is Fernando Riemers. I'm a professor of international education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I'm joined here this morning by the splendid members of the teaching team that taught with me this course last fall, as well as with a small number of students in that course whose work is presented in this book. And our goal this morning is going to be to share this book with you, to explain how it came about, what pedagogical ideas this approach to teaching policy reflects, but also share with you some of what our students learn from that work. I want to say that this is a course in education policy, in comparative education policy, that is built on the premise that it's very important to learn to write. And for that reason, I give to all my students at the beginning of the course a pen. And I tell them a pen is a mind expanding tool because once you commit your thoughts to paper, you think more clearly. And then once you make those thoughts public and you engage in a wider conversation, you think even more clearly, you sharpen your thoughts. And that's what this book is about. It's about extending work that our students carried out last semester into the public domain to make it part of a dialogue, to make it to allow it to be scrutinized, challenged, to be part of a conversation that advances truth, because that's how we advance truth, in conversation, in dialogue with each other. So this is a course in education policy that in which students are encouraged to work in teams and for a real client, typically a government agency or an international development organization that is working on vexing issues, the kinds of issues that can't be resolved quickly, that can be resolved looking up the answer in a book, that require a little more thinking, a little more time. And the idea is very simple. Use the talent of these very talented and motivated students to spend a semester working on those issues, thinking them through. And so the goal of doing that is to integrate three core functions of a university. Obviously, teaching. And the idea is to teach students to solve problems by challenging them to solve problems. I can say, having done this for many years, that some students finding a little daunting at the beginning of their academic semester of their program to be immersed in the real world of solving vexing challenges in ways that will have real consequences. But they all rise to the occasion. And certainly those whose work is published in this book did rise to the occasion. And so it's really about teaching them to do policy analysis by doing policy analysis. Of course, we don't leave them alone. They're taking a course where they're doing readings. We're meeting every week. They're meeting in section with teaching fellows. They're meeting to discuss their projects. And most importantly, they work on these projects with the benefit of peers who come from other countries. And I want to underscore the power of that because one of the goals of this course is to help students develop a comparative mindset. And a comparative mindset is developed not by reading in theory what a comparative mindset is, but by practicing it, by engaging with readings that would challenge them, that are written by people from very different geographies with different points of view, by engaging with fellow students who have different biographies, who have been in different places, who would challenge each other's assumptions. One of the things that we do in the course is we ask students at the end, to what extent did you benefit from learning in an internationally diverse group of students? And they all express that they learned quite a bit from exactly the kinds of projects we're presenting. So that's one of the functions, pedagogical. The second function is advancing the social mission of the university. We're living at a time in which more and more people are asking, what good do universities do for society anyway? Why should we care about universities? And I think that we all have a responsibility to concentrate on problems that ordinary people have and to use our talent not for navel gazing, but for solving real and consequential problems. And the work presented in this book, as you will hear in a moment, attempts to do that. And the third function that we try to integrate is the function of advancing knowledge, is the function of engaging students in gaining knowledge as they co-construct knowledge, which is then shared in a conversation as we're doing in the publication. So those are the three simple ideas. Obviously, we do these things in teams. Good work is always the product of good teamwork. And with that, let me turn it over to some of the members of this team. And I'm going to begin. Christy, are you here?
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, I'm delighted. Great to see you, Christy. So I'm turning it
Hi.
over to a splendid member of the teaching team, Christy Ardiana. Over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. Just a quick introduction. My name is Christy. So I was the TF in this class with Kalista and Suti. So it was a great learning experience for me as well. And I'm a founder and CEO of an education tech company focusing on analytical thinking and reasonings and communication skills. So I think this is the work that has been really close to my heart. But yeah, thank you so much, Professor Reimers, for the opportunity. Um, and I will talk about a couple of things. And the first one that I wanted to talk about is on why is it important to really have the opportunity to work with client on the ground for the students, and how did that change the whole learning process? And the second thing I wanted to talk about is what are the competencies that this actually builds. And I think it's really important to truly see how students build like different competencies throughout the class as well. And the third thing I wanted to talk about is like why it matters, and especially how can we transfer the learning to like other things in education policy making as well. And then I'm gonna introduce the Malaysia case. All right. So thank you so much. I wanted to start my remarks with a very simple claim, right? I feel that the moment when learning becomes tied to like a real decision making, um, that changes the whole experience for both the students and also the client, right? Everything about the learning changes, and it's not just about the paper that we make, but it actually like I feel that students really took it seriously. It changes the way they think, changes the way that they prioritize, because they basically work with so many different clients. And so I'm going to start with the first thing I wanted to talk about, which is why it's different than a learning in a traditional classroom. So in a traditional classroom, like students typically problem solve about things that are like already defined for them, right? That's like bounded. Like the professor told them, this is how it works. This is pedagogically quote unquote safer, right? And then the implicit goal for this is basically to demonstrate like understanding about the topic. But the what makes this class and like the learning is extremely different and it's special is that when you introduce like a real client, someone who actually really used the work that they produce, the goal shifts from just being correct and like pedagogically safe to actually being useful. And through my experience, like helping some of the students um, in this class, it really truly changed the way I think as well about the problem. And sometimes it could be quite difficult because, for example, the client has a different context every now and then. But there are a couple of things that I wanted to note here. Number one is actually about how we see problem, right? So the problem definition becomes uncertain, which is this is something that is a challenge for a lot of the students. But I feel that the students truly learn and quickly discover that this is how the world works, right? If they want it to be in policy making, they have to define the problem sometimes, right? What is the actual issue? Like, what is the root cause versus the symptom? And I feel that this is a very important tool that the students can learn and also implement in like other areas of their life, right? So, what does the client actually care about? What is within the scope? That's the first thing. The second thing is this is something that is very, very close to the heart of this course as well, is about trade-off. So when you talk about this course and how students basically work with the clients very closely, trade-offs become very inevitable, right? Like in theory, we would love to optimize everything. We would love to just like do everything that we want. But throughout the journey, by working with clients, you learn that trade-offs become unavoidable, right? Students have to weigh equity versus cost, for example. Like there's a discussion about short-term wins versus like long-term sustainability, and then political feasibility versus like ideal policy making. And this is an important part because they are forced to truly make decisions, not just to list options. And I think this is why this class is very valuable for me, especially when I also took the class, but I believe for other students as well. The third thing, which is also central, is feasibility, right? So feasibility becomes an important part of their analysis. So we cannot just say that, oh, this worked in Southeast Asia or this worked in Finland, right? This is something that is very important. And I feel that the competencies that this builds really is important, like judgment, communication, and lastly, stakeholder management. So I think those are the things that I believe are very crucial in this class. Thank you, Professor, and everyone. I think you're muted, Professor Reimers. Yeah.
Thank you, Christy. We're going to hear now from one of the students who took the class last semester. Nurili, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to skip the introduction and you will learn more about me as I get right into the discussion. So for chapter 3 in the book, our team worked on the issue of student dropout and reintegration in Malaysia in collaboration with Yayasan Hasana through the context of Program Anak Kita or PAK 1.0. And this is like the first phase of the intervention that was implemented nationally. So PAK 1.0, was introduced to address post-pandemic learning loss, disengagement, and school completion challenges. What made this project particularly meaningful for me personally was that I am a Yayasan Hazana scholar myself, so I already had some familiarity with the internal working culture of the foundation. And also as a Malaysian, my own background has also helped me understand the education system, the policy structure, and the social context in which those dropout happens. In addition to that, our client was Dr. Nur Anwar, which is the Senior Director of Education at Yayasan Hasana. So Dr. Nur Anwar has a very he has a role in advising and designing education initiatives that are often later proposed to the Ministry of Education in Malaysia. So his perspective as our client really helped us refine both our problem definition and implementation feasibility for the second phase of PAK 2.0. So I think like through this experience, I realized that constant and clear communication with stakeholders was essential our client. I think that's what really set this class apart from other classes because we are like client-based and where the experiential learning and PBL like it's very different from a normal class, I would say, because like it builds judgment, it builds our communication skills, and also like it helps me create skills on stakeholder management and iteration on our policy works. So one of the most realistic parts of this class and also the project was negotiating scope. So we also had another client. Her name is Ati Abdullah. She was also a student of this class, I think in 2024, and an alum of Harvard Graduate School of Education. And now she has a new role as an executive director, but she was the program manager and the founder for the idea of Program Anak Kita PK 1.0. So her insight, like having this communication, back and forth communication with her were really helpful in this process. So we were able to see what are the trade-offs, like refine, like focusing on our problem. Like we had some like in the beginning, the scope were like we were thinking like different aspects like migration, the stateless students, but having this conversation really makes us have, okay, maybe this context were not within the scope of our policy work. So we were constantly asking, were this realistic? Is this aligned with the national priorities, especially now that there are some reforms in the Malaysian development plan? Could this be implemented in the next year, which is this year, 2026? So our recommended alternatives were the AP, Accelerated Education Pathways, and we get to this kind of a result because, as Professor Rima said, this was actually an alternative recommended by my colleague Samin from Pakistan. So I think that's where having like colleagues and classmates from different countries and they're giving their own perspective, kind of like giving a novel insights on what else can be done in the policy that was made in my country, Malaysia. So I would like to shout out my classmates and my teammates, Alex from Ghana, Lily from the United States, and Samin from Pakistan for giving this very novel insight. So what really PBL taught me about producing something usable is that context matters, but research matters even more. Understanding the local context helped us define the problem, but evidence was what allowed us to justify our recommendation. Because for decision makers, policy cannot only be based on opinion, it needs to be supported by data, comparison, and clear reasoning. I think this experience and this class being taught by the TFs and also Professor Remus made me appreciate the importance of evidence-based policy, especially in education, where decisions affect large numbers of students. That is all from me. Thank you.
That's phenomenal. Thank you so much, really. We're going to hear from another member of the teaching team, Suti Heng, who's going to talk about drawing on comparative research as a way to inform ideas about what might work. Over to you, Suti.
Thank you, Prof. Remus. Hi, everybody. My name is Suti. I've been TFing this course for several iterations now. Really excited to be here with all of you, and a big congratulations to all our authors. I was thinking hard about what I wanted to say as part of my, sharing in this particular book launch, right? And I wanted to start with a little bit of a plug, if you will, right? Because ultimately our book is, if you will, a series of plugs for what we believe to be true, right? So recently I've gotten my partner into my favorite television favorite, but also what I think is one of the most important television shows recently to come out, the Star Wars Andor. If you have heard of it, maybe go watch it. One of the things that the show is about, it's really a discourse about, truth and about, what we do in a world, where truth can seem negotiable, where narratives can be much more powerful than evidence, right? As an A801 teaching fellow, I saw how all of our authors grappled with the idea of truth, and how to present that truth and to tell it in a way that will be able to be convincing to other people, right? I think what our students and the authors really had to do was to practice not just sharing what they believe to be true, but practice a kind of disciplined honesty, right? So we all know that we made use of the Bardak framework to really think through the policy problems that we thought were important, right? And in many of these office hours, students would come to me and ask, can we write about this? Can we do it this way or that way? And I can just recall all the disconcerting faces when I often repeated that you can write about whatever you want. You can put it however you want it. It's really about what you can convince your audience about, right? So I think one of the key ways in which I think all our authors have are going to try to convince you about what they believe to be true is basically through comparative evidence, right? So comparative evidence, when done in a poor way, leads to things like policy borrowing, right? So that's when we say that, something like Christy mentioned earlier, right? Just because someone I look highly up to does something, therefore it will work for me as well, right? In the same way, right? Just telling you about a show doesn't mean that everything in the show is gonna apply to the real world, right? So what our authors had to actually do instead was to be a bit more discerning, right? They had to not just select meaningful comparisons, right? So which countries would be the best ones to think about if I'm thinking about my particular context. They had to really adapt what they learned from those contexts to their local context. What are some of the challenges that are unique to their current context that maybe did not apply to the comparators that they were looking at? And then also thinking about how to then translate the kind of comparative evidence into something that can be understood by the stakeholders in their local context, right? So I think that's where all our authors really did a really wonderful work grappling with this source of evidence and then presenting their truth, So I hope that as you listen to all our authors here, you think a little bit about what you're contributing to the world in terms of truth, and how you can also tell your story. So now I want to pass the time over to Team Thailand, who will share with you what the truth is and how they might have used comparative evidence to shape their recommendations for Thailand SPP. Sanjana?
Thank you so much, Sudhi. That was a phenomenal overview, and it's such a pleasure to be here. My name is Sanjana Kothari, and I was one of the student consultants working with the UNESCO Bangkok client team. And our analysis focused essentially on educational inequality in Thailand's south border provinces, which I'll refer to in short as the SBPs. So let me give you just a little sense of where the SBPs are on the map, because that's kind of crucial to this analysis. So the SBPs are located in the southernmost region of Thailand. They border Malaysia and have almost an 80% Malay Muslim population, whereas the rest of Thailand is predominantly Thai Buddhist. And that difference really matters for education in the region. So since 2004, the area has experienced prolonged conflict along these ethnic lines, and schools have unfortunately become central sites of the violence. Hundreds of teachers have been killed, the schooling infrastructure in the region has been decimated, and as a result, the whole schooling system in the region has been deeply, deeply destabilized. And you can see the impact of that very clearly in education data. So the SBPs score among the lowest nationally in school participation and foundational literacy and numeracy outcomes, and they face amongst the highest dropout rates in the country. So in our study, we narrowed our analysis down to two root causes that were both central to these disparities, but also actionable for our client, which has a largely norm-setting role in the international organization sort of world. So the first root cause that we honed in on was the systematic exclusion of Malay Muslim language and culture from the national education system. And the second, a little bit more sort of logistical, was the disruption to schooling, especially the chronic teacher shortages caused by the ongoing conflict. And to respond to those root causes, we developed three policy alternatives, which I'll describe very briefly. So the first was to implement mother tongue-based multilingual education in government schools, which allows students to study in both Patani Malay, their home language, and Thai, which is the target or the national language. The second was the recruitment and training of community para-teachers, kind of bypassing the formal teacher pipelines to quickly remedy shortages. And the third was the use of blended digital learning programs with online-offline capabilities dependent on connectivity. So one of the biggest challenges we faced during this analysis was that research focused on the south border provinces was extremely limited. And comparative research, as Sudhi kind of beautifully captured, became really, really central to our analysis. In some cases, we decided to make regional comparisons. So we focused on countries in Southeast Asia that were culturally and structurally similar to Thailand. And in other cases, we looked at countries that were much further away on the map, but very different very similar in terms of conflict dynamics. So I'll outline a little bit how this helped us develop our final recommendations. Number one, it really helped us benchmark the scale of the problem. So when we compared the SBPs with marginalized regions in neighboring countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, we realized that disparities were just as severe and sometimes even more severe despite Thailand's much higher GDP per capita. So it made it really clear to us that this wasn't just a resource constraint, but also a structural inequality in the way that resources were being allocated. Secondly, comparative research helped us generate realistic policy alternatives. So when we looked at studies from conflict-affected contexts like Afghanistan and Nepal, we kept seeing strong evidence over and over again that community para-teacher models were effective not only for learning, but also for rebuilding trust in education systems, which was a key failure in the SBPs. And lastly, it really shaped how we evaluated our options. So from the beginning, our client had emphasized that social cohesion was a priority for them. We had to think very carefully then about whether a policy might unintentionally deepen ethnic tensions, even if it looked effective on paper. And this was something that we became very sensitive to while reviewing the literature on caste-based reservations in India, my home country, which was designed as a means of affirmative action, but has been deeply politicized and led to violent social conflict since. So after evaluating all three alternatives based on the criteria that we had defined, which were cost effectiveness, feasibility, and potential to strengthen social cohesion, we found that community parateacher models performed the strongest overall. But this wasn't a straightforward decision by any means. One of the biggest shifts in our thinking actually came about when we looked more closely at the blended digital learning option. So I'm a student in our learning design and technology program. I think about EdTech all day, every day. And at the beginning, that was the solution that was sort of closest to my heart. And it seemed like the strongest solution, especially if hardware distribution was feasible. But once we analyzed it through that social cohesion lens, that's where it became a lot more complicated. If you provide devices just in the SPPs, you could easily kind of have the population, the national population interpret that as the state treating one region differently, which is, it's almost policy suicide in a conflict-affected setting like the SPPs. But then expanding device provision to the entire national school system simply wasn't financially or logistically feasible, at least in the short run. So once we started thinking about those two constraints together, the digital option began to look much less realistic. At the same time, that's not to say that the solution that we recommended came without trade-offs. System-wide reforms like multilingual education, for example, build long-term capacity, whereas community parateachers are more of a pragmatic, short-term sort of intervention. So we were very careful in our recommendation not to frame this as a complete solution. And instead, we packaged it as a starting point, so something that could stabilize instruction now while creating the conditions for deeper reforms later. And I think just to kind of sum up, what changed the most for me over the course of the project was how I thought about what a strong solution would look like. So at the beginning, like I said, I was convinced that blended digital learning was the way. But the more that we engaged with comparative research, the more it became clear that in conflict-affected settings, things like trust and feasibility, and even political will matter so much more than how how innovative a solution looks on paper. So that was a real sort of, it was an insight that I'll carry with me, I think, into the rest of my career. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Professor Reimers.
That was splendid. Sanjana, thank you so very much. Let's hear from another member of the teaching team, Kalista Thoni. Over to you, Kalista.
Thank you, Professor Reimers, and it's great to be with everyone here. I'm very proud of the students who have been able to reach this milestone and join a community of many A801 student authors who have published books all over the years, reflecting on different policy challenges globally. I'm talking today a little bit about our model and how this class is really unique in that it focuses a lot on communities of practice. There are communities in many different levels in this course. Students are all required to form a team, at least of one other person, so pairs or groups of four. And throughout the semester, they work together in these communities to really refine their analysis, to define the problem, to work with a client, and really work towards the point that they've reached today, which is publishing a very polished policy analysis. And I think community is a very central part of the learning experience in 801 because there's a lot of space for feedback, there's a lot of space for discussion, all of which strengthens the quality of policy analysis. And as a teaching team, together with Christy, Suti, and Professor Reimers, we're very intentional about designing this through the activities that we introduce in classes. And so I think earlier, Nuruli might have mentioned how the class is very dynamic. You never sit quite in your spot for the whole 3 hours. You are moving from group to group. Maybe you're interacting between groups where you're getting to learn from the policy analysis of another region, another context, or you might be just within your group and thinking about how the themes of that class for the day apply to your context and setting. And so then there's another dimension of community, which is in the TF sections, right? In our teaching fellow sections, which are an even smaller group, where we're able to break down issues and challenges and really get feedback directly on peer work. And so one of the things that I really enjoyed doing with my TF section was the fishbowl, where we would get one of the peer team groups to present their work for that particular week, and students would be able to give feedback directly to that peer. And it was, I think, a very productive exercise in advancing the chapters and the quality of the policy analysis, because there was a lot of psychological safety to really be open and honest about what they were struggling with. there was a norm of constructive feedback and things that would really, and asking questions in a way that would really enhance what students were working on. And there was a lot of iteration, right? They were each week or each milestone that we set up in this course allowed students to progress in their paper. So this is one of the things that I really enjoyed about the course, having both taken it and now being a teaching fellow for it. And I think lastly, the part of situated learning is something that students don't quite always get in typical learning experiences. The chance to actually work on policy analysis with a real client in real time often brings about many challenges, but also offers the opportunity to turn the theory that we're learning into class into something that's professional and applied. So that's a little bit about, I think, the third component of the pedagogical model of this course that really has made these students, hopefully, in my words or in my observations, learn significantly, and I think will be a very formative learning experience for them. And I'll invite Deborah now to share a little bit more about how that translated into her work in Nepal. Thank you, Deborah. Go ahead.
Hello, thank you everybody. And I'm here to speak on behalf of my amazing teammates, Natasha, Aria, and Delphina, on how this community of practice model shaped our work in Nepal. So we were working with the University of Nepal, who wanted to launch a School of Public Policy program in the autumn of 2026. And our problem statement was that the higher education system in Nepal was overly theoretical, exam orientated, and disconnected from the practical skills and the relevant curriculum that were needed to raise up effective policymakers in the nation. Now, team and community feedback helped us incredibly because I still remember our first paper, and for some reason, we felt like we were tasked to solve all the issues related to democracy in Nepal, ranging from job opportunities to the state of the economy to the political culture. Our title was Uncovering Democracy in Nepal. And we got some very honest but kind feedback that said, sorry, but you're working with a university in Nepal, not with the government, and you don't have unlimited funds. Narrow your definition of the problem. And that was incredibly helpful because then we began to understand that the problem wasn't necessarily the state of the economy or the political dynamic of the nation. The problem was that the way of approaching higher education was not appropriate for the needs of the nation. And then we narrowed our problem statement to what I opened up my section with. We came up with 3 alternatives: a modularized experiential learning program, a curriculum advisory council, and a public leadership fellowship program. And we weren't done when it came to peer feedback. When we were thinking about our criteria, the feedback from our peers in our teaching fellow sections was incredibly helpful. So I remember that we started off with 5 criteria, one of which was operational feasibility. But after speaking to some of our peers, they told us that because your client is a university and because of the constraints related to the time they want to roll out the program and what they can and can't do, maybe you shouldn't prioritize operational feasibility as a criteria because you wouldn't recommend anything to your client that they wouldn't be able to do as a university. And that was incredibly true, given the fact that we'd now narrowed our problem statement relating solely to the design of the project, of the program. So that was really helpful, and it helped us to narrow down what we were researching and devote more of our time and our attention to criteria that would actually help our client, rather than things that would just take up word count and space. So we settled on the criteria of effectiveness, which is skill acquisition, accessibility and equity, and cost efficiency. We decided to recommend Alternative 3, which was the PLFP, which stands for the Public Leadership Fellowship Program, in agreement with the Curriculum Advisory Board. And this was because the PLFP had the highest levels of skill acquisition. It would provide students with training, placements in the policy sector, and create more clear career pathways and mentorship opportunities for upcoming professionals. Furthermore, the Curriculum Advisory Council would ensure that the curriculum was relevant globally in terms of its context, but also taught students the knowledge they needed to make effective policy in the nation of Nepal. And I'll close off by speaking about what this situated learning experience taught me about designing for implementation. Some of my key takeaways are that you cannot separate policy from context. Whatever you recommend will actually be used by real people in real settings. And if you're ignorant of social, economic, and institutional constraints, you're doing yourself a massive disservice. Our client wanted to launch a program this year. If we gave him information that was not relevant to his context or his institutional constraints, it would have been very disappointing because he trusted us with a very large and important project. And finally, I'd like to say that theory is not learnt so that we feel good about how intelligent we are. It's learnt so that we can make concrete change. So Bardak's Eightfold Path isn't just something I can recite from memory. It's actually something that I can show you in a tangible product affecting real people. Thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you so much, Deborah. We're going to hear now from two other students who are going to share the work they did and what they took away from it. Let's hear from Allegra.
Thank you so much, Fernando. Hello, my name is Allegra Istar. I'm so excited to be here on behalf of my awesome team of Attila, Radian, and Samrudi, and I'll be speaking about Chapter 8 of the book and our work on teacher absenteeism in Papua, Indonesia, in collaboration with UNICEF Papua. So by way of short introduction, Papua is Indonesia's easternmost region across 17,000 islands. It is mountainous, highly remote, and with infrastructure that is still developing. Many communities only are accessible by small aircraft or hours of travel. So in this context, teacher absenteeism is a large and very system-defining issue. Studies suggest that like 30 to 40% of teachers are absent on any given day. So in practice, many classrooms exist without teaching at all. For my team and I, we looked at this problem and we thought this is a huge, huge and deeply complex problem. And the more we dug into it and looked at it, the more complex the problem became, more layers and more actors and more constraints. But the policy framework we use by Bardak, step one is to define the problem, and not just to do that, but to define the problem in a way that is manageable and relevant. So we had to be disciplined about scope. Not everything that matters is something that we can act on, and definitely not all at once. Therefore, we had to keep in mind UNICEF Papua's mandate. UNICEF isn't the actor that can actually rebuild infrastructure or redesign systems or control teacher appointment at all, but its role is to convene and advise and support. So instead of asking for us what the ideal solution was, we ended up moving towards a different question, which is what is actionable and what can UNICEF actually move? From there, we had three alternatives. The first was developing a local teacher pipeline where we hire and train community-based teaching assistants to build a local workforce over time. Second was to target structural supports like housing or transport to further support teachers and reduce any physical barriers. And third was local communication and participatory governance, which is using these different community-based messaging and structured school community forums and parent groups to strengthen accountability in the community around teacher presence. And after mulling it over for a while, we ultimately recommended the third. Not necessarily because it is the most comprehensive, but because it is the most actionable entry point within UNICEF's role. It's lower cost, it's scalable, and it directly leverages UNICEF's strengths in community engagement and norm shifting. So strengthen the local accountability first, and then create conditions for more structural reforms later. So in terms of what we ended up delivering, the impact was not just diagnosing the problem, but a decision-ready pathway where we can lay out this clear alternative and sequence what our client could then realistically act on. And I think that was the core lesson for our group, that policy analysis isn't just about identifying what works, but about identifying what you can actually move given your constraints and feasibility, like Deborah mentioned. Bringing it back to Bardak, a good policy analysis is not simply problem solving, but someone has to clarify what is possible and for whom and under what conditions. And I think that for us was the real work that we did. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Allegra. Let's now hear from Clover Chen, who's going to talk about the work that they did for the government of Coahuila on environmental education. Clover, over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Reimers. I'm happy to be here today representing my team of four, Emma, Sarah, and Sol, who I worked with on this project, collaborating with the Secretariat of Education in Coahuila. For context, Coahuila is a northern state in Mexico. and it is known for being a hub for automotive manufacturing and coal production. And these are all great industries for the economy in Mexico, but they are also industries that can be a polluting field or take an environmental toll. And while Coahuila is a beautiful state with many different environmental landscapes, it also is at risk for environmental change when climate change occurs. So there's this tension between what Coahuila is doing and what it can be affected by when it comes to climate change. And that's why environmental education is an important entry point here. And given this, in the national government and the state government, there are mandates for environmental education to be a priority. They recognize that that's an important thing to consider in education. Yet only 3 of 58 projects that are active in Coahuila's education system have mentioned environmental education at all, and only 1 is focused on it. So we did some research and some talking to folks, and we identified 3 reasons why this could be the case, which are the difficulties around defining what is environmental education, what does that look like in practice, and also a lack of teacher preparation, acknowledging the busy lives of teachers and how it's difficult to add on another layer to what they need to do. And finally, competing political priorities around what the government wants to prioritize when it comes to these initiatives that they're funding and backing. Other things like social emotional learning or literacy rates take the precedence when it comes to these, where to put their attention. So given that, we were thinking through different options on how to bolster environmental education in Coahuila. And after considering 3 options, which included a option that integrated environmental education further and scaled further the one initiative that focused on environmental education, and also considered another option where we would do the same thing, but with a focus on teacher training to help prep those teachers that weren't ready or didn't have capacity to implement environmental education, we landed on ultimately bringing in environmental education to a project that was more focused on social emotional learning. And this was the case because although those other 2 projects were more focused on environmental education itself, when we considered how much this social emotional learning program reached 68% of schools, and it was way more cost effective and more accessible to rural regions in Coahuila, it made the most sense in this context. And I summarize all this to say that I think through this process of needing to determine what to recommend to the government of Coahuila, it was, like my peers said, a very iterative, very winding road to that final destination. And I think part of that winding road was the fact that when a friend tells you a problem, a lot of people's first instinct is to give advice and say, oh, well, I think I would do this. And unfortunately, for policy analysis and real world impact and context, that's not helpful to anyone but yourself. And so learning through this process to fight that human instinct to give advice and consider yourself over other people's point of view was maybe one of the biggest takeaways of this learning experience. While throughout our research process, we looked at literature and we looked at different people's background and expertise, ultimately we needed to consider both the evidence and the context and people that the recommendation was going to be serving. And that's what led us to our final recommendation. So to conclude in a broader reflection of this learning experience in A801 and working with clients and translating our knowledge from the classroom into an actual real world problem, I think it really helped me understand that it's very easy for institutions, higher education institutions, to creates research just for the sake of creating research, rather than thinking about creating research for the purpose of changing the world. And so not only was this policy analysis exercise really helpful for my own team and I's meaning making and understanding of what is important to consider in policy analysis, but it also made a real world impact and helped out the government of Kuala, and hopefully by consequence helped many students learn more about environmental education. So I'm really grateful to be here today and be a part of this process.
Thank you so much, Clover, and thank you all of you. This was just terrific. So at this point, I invite all of those of you who are attending this seminar to post your questions in the Q&A section. And but I'm going to, before we read those questions, I'm going to invite someone who I saw was attending today, and I didn't know you were coming. Sarah Mustafa is a former student, and I'm delighted you're here, Sarah. So I wanted to invite you to share your thoughts on what you heard this morning.
Thank you so much, Professor Fernando. Hi, everyone. I'm so grateful for technology and then for you to be able to join. I'm joining from Iraq. And you know, we have been under bombardments for the last 25 days. It's war in this region and schools are closed. And more than 12 million plus students are now at home. They haven't been to school for the last 25 days. And we pray and hope that all of this ends very soon. I had the privilege to take Professor Fernando's course when I was getting my master's degree at the Kennedy School in 2024-2025 academic year. And when I was there, I was so excited to come back to Iraq and try to make interventions and solve all the problems we have in our education system. And then when I come back and try to make an intervention, the reality hits me. So what I appreciate about all the work that you have been doing and all the amazing and valuable work that Professor Fernando is doing using comparative approach is you do not only throw amazing, sparkling solutions and frameworks and ask people in different parts of the world, go use it. The realities are extremely different, very, very complicated here on the ground. In a country, for instance, like a post-conflict country like Iraq, which is not a post-conflict anymore. Again, we are in war. That has been facing protracted conflict for the last 2 decades. Priorities are very different now. I received an email from Professor Fernando 2 weeks ago that why not seizing this opportunity and try to make an intervention when it comes to introducing AI-powered educational tools. Students are at home, they need help. They cannot go to school, and actually at the moment we are studying some tools to see how we can help students with math because we don't know when schools will open. But I started a project on AI literacy. We are helping ministries of education and schools with regulatory frameworks and AI literacy programs. And for the last 3 weeks, I've been talking to people, and they are like, this is not the right time to talk about AI literacy. We are under bombardments. We have other priorities. Teachers, I've been talking to teachers, and they are scared and they are hiding at home. Kids are panicked, parents are worried. So it's very important to know what priorities are on the ground. And that's why I really appreciate what for instance, Sanjana mentioned about cultural, religious, ethnic differences. These countries in the Middle East and the Global South, and a country like Iraq is deeply divided when it comes to religious, ethnic realities and resources. Also, other presenters mentioned, actually, I wanted to mention everyone's name, Deborah, Nurili, Clover, Christy, Suti, Kalista, everyone, thank you so much. Resources are constrained here in this part of the world. Also, political will. Do our leaders have the will to introduce frameworks, policy frameworks that really affect and improve learning and teaching in countries like ours? And of course, again, as I mentioned, we have social constraints like deeply divided religious and ethnic communities. I haven't read the book yet, but I've ordered my copy, and hopefully I will receive it very soon. I really want to thank you so much. When I was in the States, and still when I talk to people from abroad and education leaders, experts, scientists, they really come up with great ideas to solve problems when it comes to education systems. But on the ground, it's way more complicated. And I truly appreciate what you have been doing. I'm learning a lot. We are learning from you. This is so valuable. This is what we need in this part of the world. Thank you so much, Professor Fernando. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. I can only imagine how difficult the situation is when you have been under bombardment, and we do hope and pray for peace soon in your region. But I think that with your presence here, and it must be very late for you, I think right now, you also illustrate another component of this whole process, which is that in making the knowledge that is generated by these students public, this is a way to connect, to close these loops with people like yourself, change makers in the real world, and connect them to the academy. And we have all learned from what you have just said. I want to bring in someone who I also saw was attending, Patricia Vasquez, who's a dear former student, former Secretary of Education of the state of Puebla. And I'd like to invite you, Patricia, to share a few thoughts on what you just heard today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Professor Reimers. I would say like my words will never be more important than Sarah's words. So our prayers and all the energy and everything that we can do, Sarah, for you and the people from Iraq. We are just here, far away from your country, but very close to your heart. And I think that I want to start from there. I think that I'm always like enrolling to whatever Professor Reimers does, and the students and the program, and happy to see that this week was a very important week for you, for your students, for your programs, because this is the second seminar that I've been joining. So I'm super happy to on doing that, but also pointful because I think that this morning, I think that like the worldwide already knows that the Global Education Monitoring Report was released. And I think that we do have very bad news in terms of access, of learning outcomes, and many kids out of school. And I love the phrase that that the report was saying, like getting children through the school gate is only half of the battle. And I think that what you were saying, and also I haven't read the book, but promise that I'm going to have it in my hands very soon. But I think that every presentation, every experience, every review of what is happening in different spots in the world are just trying to go that way. Like, yeah, school is important. Getting kids into schools is very important. We need to do more about that. So I just want to congratulate again Dr. Reimers for this extraordinary presentation, for listening, for promoting students to think out of the border, but also to think more deep on how we need to be more connected and how we need to share more experiences and how we need to be a worldwide community of educators promoting the right to learn everywhere independently where you were born. So I just want to say that happy to be here, happy just to applaud every initiative that you do. And also, Sarah, my prayers for you and your people.
Patricia, thank you so very much for joining us and for those words. You did mention the Global Education Monitoring Report, which is indeed being released today. I don't think it's necessarily bad news. Like everything, it's a half full, half empty. I think if you look at the long view, in fact, that report tells us there's been tremendous progress. But yeah, there's more than 250,000 children who are out of school. And some of those children were studied by the teams whose work is presented here. And they studied what would it take to advance it. I do want to say how important it is that an organization like UNESCO and the team that Manos Antonini leads in the Global Monitoring Education Report takes the time to generate that evidence and make it available so that it can animate a conversation that has to include more people than themselves. I mean, we are at a moment in which the very idea of international collaboration in education is being challenged by very different views of how nations want to engage with the rest of the world. And that makes it even more admirable that UNESCO remains committed to activities like generating information on where we are. And I think to do it in a way that is very valuable. I mean, the long view that they take to help us discern patterns over decades, as opposed to looking at what works, in a very short time frame, is very, very useful. So anyway, let's now turn it over to your questions, because we only have 6 more minutes. And I see that Natasha Lavides has posted one question, and I'd like to invite anyone on the panel, maybe a couple of you, to answer that. It's a great question. She begins with, "You're all so awesome. I agree. I was curious," she says, "how do you plan to use what you have learned from these projects in your future endeavors?" It's a great question. Are there any transferable skills that you have learned here? So yes, you wrote a great chapter, but the question is, so what? And so I'd love to hear some of you think about that so what question.
I don't mind jumping off to answer first. My heart goes out to Natasha. She's my wonderful teammate. But yes, I intend to use mainly the skills of problem solving. I thought I had problem solving skills, but it's one thing to solve a problem in your context. It's another thing to solve a problem in a different context. And I will never again undervalue the power of a good literature review. And not just a literature review that focuses on academic articles, but literature reviews that talk about government reports, sector reports, even if you can speak to stakeholders, looking at articles, looking at interviews. For us, for our team, it was very important because none of us had been to Nepal or knew much about the context of Nepal. We had to really immerse ourselves in literature about the country's history politically, the higher education system, even colonial ties and influences from neighboring countries. And it showed me that you have to make an effort when you're working with a client who's different to you to actually understanding where they're coming from and what's going on in their nation. And I think that skill has been incredibly valuable because our client even said that he'd like to keep us on his team for future projects and present to different stakeholders. So yeah, I think the power of a literature review and really immersing yourself in a context for problem solving.
Thank you so much. Anyone else who would like to answer that question? What skills would carry? And really,
Maybe I can also add on that I would also really wouldn't I'm really supporting the you're saying that literature review is really important because I'm the kind of person I'm coming from the learning design innovation and technology, so I have all these novel ideas and I really want to do all of them, right? But then I think Professor Remus, when you were coaching our group, you mentioned the importance about data again and again. And you say to us that even though your client wants this criteria, but are you sure based on the research that you have found that this is the right thing to do? So I think what I learned, like the skills, is that still goes for novelty. I think Bartek also mentioned in his book that we should also always aim to do something new and novel, but make sure that it is grounded in theory and also data and evidence. Like, make sure that it is feasible. So I think these skills are very transferable in terms of, like, if I want to do startup, or if I want to do like a project, an intervention, it's not only applicable to policy work, but also to other aspects of life as well. Yeah.
maybe one last comment on that question, Clover.
Yeah, thanks so much. I first want to say thank you, Sarah and Patricia, for being here. It's very nice to meet you and hear your stories, and thank you for sharing. I think what I've learned and my biggest takeaway from this course and the project and conducting this policy analysis is that it's really affirmed for me that at the end of the day, it's all about the people. And there is nothing that exists or is helpful without hearing from real people. I remember that at a certain point in our process, we hit a wall and we didn't know which recommendation to go with, and we didn't know which criteria to be using. And then we spoke to people. We spoke to people that designed one of the programs that we were researching. And through them and their stories, we learned so much more about the students themselves. We learned about the region. We learned about the struggles between rural regions versus urban, and how there's displacement and migration between the state internally. And we wouldn't have learned any of this if we had stayed in only the literature, or only considering equity, but not considering what type of equity that was relevant for our context. So again, I think just learning about the people and remembering who we are working for is really important.
Terrific. Let me conclude by asking those of you on the panel, both students and the teaching team, a question. I was yesterday in conversation with a group of university leaders from a range of universities, mostly in the UK, about the topic of innovation in higher education. And I did mention this course and this particular way of teaching that tries to integrate the development of new skills, the generation of knowledge, and social impact. And one of them said, well, that sounds like a lot of work. And my response was, actually, not really. I don't really think there's a lot of work. It's just thinking differently about what the work is. And what came to mind recently, one of my sons shared with me a fascinating article on Olympic swimmers. It's a very good ethnography on Olympic swimmers. And what I love about the article is that it argues that becoming an Olympic swimmer isn't necessarily about working 10 times harder than other people. It's about taking on different challenges for yourself, putting yourself in a challenging situation. And it reminded me that for many of you, when you began this project at the beginning, you did feel like this was a big challenge that you were taking on. But I think in the end, this was just normal. This was just regular work. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether this is, from your point of view, a lot of work. If you were having that conversation with university leaders who are considering, should we find a way to institutionalize that? Is this about a lot of work, or is this about different work?
I think it's about different work, and I think like having my friends in this together help ease those challenges. And I think the group work is what makes all of this possible, and also the different context that they carry towards the class as well.
Thank you, Norili. Anyone else has any views on that? Sanjana.
I think Yes, I think the stakes are just so different when you're tackling a real world problem, you're talking to real people, you know that your recommendation sort of has to think through all of the complexities on the ground. I think it was Christy who said, the stakes just change so completely. And yes, it is a lot of work, but it's work that's worth doing, because at the end of the day that, this is it's preparation for the real world. And that I think is the purpose of a good education.
Thank you, Sanjana. Anyone else has any views on that?
I'll add just a little bit. I think it's both like a lot of work and also it's a different kind of work. But I feel like what's really special about this whole process is I think that students really learn about a new skill, which is stakeholder management, which I really saw how like each of them really grew in trying to really understanding like the people that they work with. So I think what is important is that they learn that education and policy are not just a technical thing, but they're also sometimes political and relational, right? Like you need to understand what works in one context and what doesn't. So yeah, I think it's really worth it, like what Sanjana said.
Well, thank you all very much. We are at time. I very much appreciate our students showing up and doing these great presentations, and the members of the teaching team as well, and all of you who joined us this morning. I really encourage you to read this book. I think the beauty of this book is not just in each of the excellent chapters that it contains, but in looking at the constellation. I do think that comparative education, this ability to look at the world in all its richness and complexity, is the most stimulating act of human imagination and creativity. And so I can tell you that in the current state of the world, with all its challenges, and Sarah talked about some of them, I find great hope every morning in the work of students like the ones who presented today, who are taking on one problem, one step at a time, and trying to do what they can to help solve them. So on that, I wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye.